Good morning, dear Liberal friends and dear friends from other parties. A very welcome here in The Hague, a very welcome here in the Netherlands, a welcome here at the Telder Stichting, the Telders Foundation, and a very dear welcome from the European Liberal Forum. The European Liberal Forum is, I call it always the ELF. My name is Roel Martens. I'm a member of the board of ELF, and I now open this very interesting seminar. The balance of competences in a multi-level government system. What a great topic you will discuss today here. And what a pleasure for ELF to nourish the liberal discussion on this topic. Allow me to make a few words, say a few words about the European Liberal Forum, the ELF. ELF is a foundation, is the foundation of the European Liberal Democrats, the ALDE party in the European Parliament. ELF issues publications on liberalism and on European policy issues. We provide a space for liberal discussion on European politics. We offer training for liberal-minded citizens. Our aim as ELF is to promote an active European citizenship. ELF is made up of a growing number, at the moment it's about 40, a growing number of European liberal think tanks, political foundations and liberal institutes, and the diversity of our membership provides us with a wealth of knowledge and a constant source of innovation and inspiration. On the basis of a subsidy of about 1 million from the European Parliament per year, depends on how many seats we have in the European Parliament, so we get a little bit less money at this year, unfortunately. So on the basis of this subsidy, we provide our members, and among the members, a very honored member is the Telder Foundation. We provide our members with opportunities to cooperate on European projects. We work throughout Europe, in the EU, but also in our EU neighborhood countries. And the dynamic nature of ELF allows us to be at the forefront in promoting active citizenship, getting the citizen involved with European issues, and building an open liberal Europe. I think the topic you will discuss today is great, also because it's a little bit overwhelming. And I sincerely wish you success, and I hope, where possible, you will translate the discussion into operational advice or measures with regard for implementation. For instance, if you conclude on rebalancing competences, how to make that happen? Will you advise to make a new EU treaty? Or if you conclude that multi-level governance is inevitable for some aspects of our globalizing business and societies, how then to ensure a multi-level democratic system when we have a political party system that is nation-based? I wish you success. The ELF community looks forward to your conclusions and your operational advice, and your advice especially for the next steps, be they liberal or be they not liberal. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you, Roel, for introducing ELF and opening the conference. I'm also going to say a few words. First of all, welcome to all of you. Also, those who were a bit late, and there are a few people still that we expect to arrive a bit later on. For those who do not know the Telders Foundation, I am going to open with a few words about our activities. And maybe it's good to know for a start that it is a Telders Foundation, not Telder Foundation, named after Mr. Telders, who was a chairman of a predecessor of the Dutch Liberal Party, VVD. As a Telders Foundation, we are a Dutch liberal think tank related to the VVD, the main party in parliament at the moment. And we organize all kinds of symposia, conferences, summer school on liberalism, and a yearly Telders lecture, which we happened to have had last week. and where Larry Ziedentop, a historian, philosopher from the United States, United Kingdom, spoke about the deep roots of liberalism in European history, in early Christianity and in the early medieval ages. We also bring out reports on all kinds of political topics, always with the liberal principles as our base. And we publish all kinds of books on the historical and philosophical basis of liberalism. For example, coming December, we will publish a book on social liberalism, its real meaning, which is quite something different than some politicians and parties that claim to be social liberal pretend. That's something coming on in next December. Unfortunately, for those who only speak English, this publication will be in Dutch. And we, for example, also published last September, so last month, something on a phenomenon that doesn't exist at all, except concerning to some of our opponents, and that is neoliberalism. We call this book Neoliberalism a Political Fiction, because it only exists in those left-wing opponents of liberalism, and all kinds of ugly things are ascribed to these neoliberals. We also had some earlier publications under the flag of ELF, as Telders Foundation, on the separation of church and state in Europe, on democracy in Europe, of the people, by the people, for the people. Is Europe really democratic? On the dynamics of demographic decline, and our last in this series was juridification in Europe, the balance of power and pressure. And this conference is a working conference, also to give input to the next publication under the flag of ELF, which we want to bring out next year. And some of the speakers, or all of the speakers, I think, are authors, will be authors of this publication. The theme of today is the EU competence review. Well, it's trying to seek the suitable level of policy making and policy decision making, and also digging a bit deeper than the usual debate between the Europhiles and the Eurosceptics, or whatever you like to call them. It is important also because not only the British government under David Cameron wants to renationalize some topics, but also the VVD in its election manifesto said that the same policy goal was strived after, and it was also part of the main document under the present coalition with the Social Democrats. As the foreigners maybe know, the Liberals in the Netherlands at the present rule this country together with the Social Democrats. Charlotte, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think we're about to start. I just want to welcome everyone also on my behalf. It was a pleasure organizing it. I would like to stress the importance of signing the signature list that is in the back of this room. And one comment is that we unfortunately lost, yesterday I heard that our speaker, Cora van Nieuwenhuizen, our MEP from the VVD, will not attend today, unfortunately. So we will have to see how we arrange the gap that is now in the program. Maybe we'll use it for a little bit more of extended discussion. Or we bring the speakers forward. We'll see. We'll just have to be flexible a little bit in that. I would like now, finally, to start with the first speaker. This is Casper van den Berg. He is an assistant professor at the Institute of Public Administration here at the Universiteit of Leiden, Campus De Hague. Last year he was a visiting scholar at Princeton University. He teaches such courses as public management, politics, governance in the media, multi-level governance. And he recently received a prestigious Veni allowance for his international comparative research of politicization of top civil servants. And Casper is also a member of the board of editors of our quarterly journal of the Telder Stichting. It's called Liberaal Revij. Good luck, Casper.
Thanks, Charlotte, for your kind words, and thanks for having me here this morning to give the kickoff a little bit of this working conference, which I maybe a little bit pretentiously liked to call the virtues and vices of multi-level governance from a liberal perspective. And I think the purpose of this presentation will be to set the scene a little bit, to give a bit of context, to give a little bit of the context in which the concept of multi-level governance has developed, how we can think about it, and also to provide a little bit of conceptual clarity, which may be useful for the discussion later on today. So basically in the next 30 minutes or so, I would like to touch on the following topics. What is multi-level governance, both as an analytical concept and as an empirical reality, to touch a little bit on the novelty of multi-level governance, and I put a deliberate question mark behind that. Then that point about the virtues and vices of multi-level governance, specifically from the perspective of liberal thought, and to end with some points of the implications and discussions of that. So, what is multi-level governance? As I said, I think it's useful to make a distinction between multi-level governance on the one hand as an analytical concept, an approach to understanding processes of political and societal steering, and on the other hand, thinking about multi-level governance as an empirical, empirically manifested type of governance. Now, the origins, if we look at the academic literature on this, the origins of the term multi-level governance, when was it used first? This was in the early 90s by scholars of European integration who tried to explain the EU structural policies as they came about in the 1980s. And basically their idea was that the classical explanatory theories of European integration, namely intergovernmentalism and of course neo-functionalism, were falling short in their explanatory power of what was actually happening also within the member states. So rather than taking a state-centric approach to European integration, their idea was that it would be worth looking at also what was happening within those member states and the interaction between the two levels in a more complex setting. So whereas the classical approaches were more had their foundations in international relations, the idea here was to also combine other types of thinking about politics, administration in the member states with what was happening at the EU level. So basically the idea then was that actors are not unitary or monolithic, even not unitary EU member states, and that politics obviously takes place in a complex and differentiated ensemble of actors and institutions. Now, looking at that literature, we can say on the one hand it's an analytical approach, a way of thinking that we see a lot in the literature, but of course it's referred to an empirical manifestation of that as well. Now, I think it might be helpful to think of what are then what is the consensus, what multi-level governance really entails, because I think this will facilitate the discussion later on today. And basically there are two dimensions when we talk about multi-level governance. Firstly, it is the vertical one, which has two aspects. One, and this is maybe the most important one, and also I think the core of what is on the program for today, is a division of power and competencies across layers of governance. And this basically means that there is no concentration of power at one particular level of government. Secondly, and this is something that is equally important in my view, is that the relationship, so basically the intergovernmental relationship, not intergovernmental between states, but intergovernmental in a vertical way, how the different layers of government relate to one another, and that there is an increasingly non-hierarchical relationship there. So yes, it's hierarchical in the sense that every member state is of course nested within the European Union, and all of the regions within one member state are nested within that member state, but there is a large degree of interdependence in that relationship between the different levels. So that's the vertical dimension. Now the horizontal dimension is something I also want to stress in this presentation, because maybe when we talk about the review of competences, etc., we are tempted to really think about only that vertical dimension, and maybe our concerns about what's happening in the EU from an efficiency point of view, from a democratic point of view, are focused on that vertical dimension, but maybe also for the discussion it will help to include that horizontal dimension as the literature suggests is also part of multi-level governance. And that horizontal dimension basically entails that power is shared between state actors, semi-state actors, and non-state actors, or private actors, rather than being predominantly concentrated with state actors. So here we see that yes, there is a multi-level side, but there's also a governance side to multi-level governance. And lastly, that institutional relations are determined through negotiations and networks as a complement, not replacing constitutional provisions, but complementary to constitutional provisions. So basically, when we are concerned about what's happening in the EU, I think it's worth not just looking at that vertical dimension, but also looking at the horizontal dimension, because it might well be that the problems we see may have to do more with the method with which governance and regulation is taking place, rather than the division across layers of government. Now, as I said, how new is multi-level governance really? What you see here on the slide is a map of Europe in the late Middle Ages, basically, and if we think about the four aspects of multi-level governance on this slide, is this something that we only see since the 1980s, or is this something the seeds of which are very much characteristics of governance as we've known it for many, many centuries? And a couple of examples I would like to give here are, of course, the Roman Empire, very much multi-level, also to some extent in the sense that there are different layers of government and that are also interdependent, not necessarily hierarchical. Also the role of, for instance, non-state actors, we can see in this period of time in the Middle Ages, the role of the Catholic Church, for instance, in taking decisions in societal steering, in providing public services, if you will. The role of the guilds, for instance, in medieval city-states, but even closer to the present day, if we look at the Age of Empire, international trading networks, etc., and as recent as, for instance, in the Netherlands and other consensus politics-oriented countries, if we look at the pillarized welfare states, where of course many aspects of multi-level governance in the sense of the inclusion of non-state and semi-state actors has been the norm. So basically the question is, how new is it really? Is it an intensification, or is it really a revolution? And really, how should we then interpret the good things and maybe the problematic things about this? Let's start with the good things. The virtues. So basically a great advantage that a multi-level governance approach or a multi-level governance system would offer us is the flexibility, the inclusiveness, and the possibility to differentiate in terms of governance arrangements. And those advantages are firstly claimed to lead to higher degrees of efficiency, where governance reflects the efficient production of public goods given their economies of scale and externalities. Basically what this means is that multi-level governance increases the problem-solving capacity of political systems and administrative systems as well. And also that it can boost legitimacy in the sense that a broader range of actors is involved and a wider support can be rallied for specific decisions or specific systems, if you will. And the efficiency is then also related to that flexibility in the sense that there can be a tailored solution. Every policy problem can be addressed or attacked, if you will, at the most appropriate level where the best results can be expected. So this would be actually the core argument in favor of more multi-level governance. But there's also other arguments. The argument of distribution, for instance. A governance system that reflects the distribution of power in society. And here maybe not European integration would be the most prominent example, but more if we look at regionalization or devolution, for instance, where there can be more or less autonomy for the regions. If we look at the countries like Spain and Italy, where regionalization has taken place, of course the UK is a case in point, but also the federalization of Belgium can be seen in that light. So here also multi-level governance in the sense of more autonomy for those entities within the traditional member states can be an argument for in favor of multi-level governance. And lastly, the idea of identity, that governance is an expression of community and the demand for self-rule by normatively distinct and territorially based groups. The question, of course, is how do we define and demarcate these groups, and how can multi-level governance actually be a way of strengthening the quality and the legitimacy of governance rather than detracting from that. Then the vices. I think the most important problem we may have with multi-level governance from a liberal point of view is what is the place for democracy. One of the most prominent drawbacks of multi-level governance is that we see a governance that is increasingly diffuse, increasingly problematic to be accountable, and also where we have a question of the extent to which there is actual deliberation taking place with real participation, real input from a large variety of actors, or that in fact what we see is a political administrative system that has become self-steering and accountable to none. And secondly, there is a big question of what is still the basis for political authority. If we looked at that map of Europe in the Middle Ages, of course, political authority was was organized much differently. But also we have become used to the idea that there is a solid basis for political authority in the national community, for instance. Now, what we see as a result of multi-level governance is that basically decisions and deliberations and debates are taking in other venues than the traditional parliamentary venues, or with other means than the traditional representative democratic means. So we see a deparliamentarization, we see also a technocratization and a bureaucratization, which I will come to in a minute as well. And lastly, how virtuous is inclusiveness really? I mean, it has a very positive ring to it, but at the same time, and I think we discussed it just before we started during the coffee already, is it really something that gives a chance to everybody, to include everybody's interests, or is it basically a very asymmetrical development where those with the loudest voice can participate and others do not? So in other words, does broadening up the range of actors allow also for a multiplication of the total power and influence, or is it just a reshuffling where not really everybody benefits to the same extent? So is it power sharing or power competition? And also, to what extent is inclusiveness really contributing to the efficiency and effectiveness of decision making and policy implementation? Does it also have its boundaries? Where is the tipping point? That may be a point for discussion. And as I said, multi-level governance has a very strong normative ring to it. As long as we all sit around the table, and rather than with a command and control kind of approach, we try to, with sweet reason, talk things through, find our common ground, and make decisions based on that, then all of the power differences, all of the differences in interest will easily give way, you would say. But is that really the case? The question, of course, is, does multi-level governance then really lead us into a world beyond conflict? And one of the arguments there would be, if multi-level governance is based on bargaining, bargaining, of course, implies that there are strong differences in interest, strong differences in resources, because otherwise there would be a much more natural consensus, basically. So what can multi-level governance really do to change that situation, or should we be more critical about that? So bargaining is, of course, all about interest and resources. And one point to make is that there is a fine line between what natural or spontaneous consensus can arise, or where there is a situation where we all sit around the table, but there are some actors who are, of course, stronger than others, who can impose their will and their interest on other players who have a less strong position. And lastly here, the politics of informality. To what extent does that lead to a less equal access to power? Because of course we can talk about the rigidity of constitutionalism, the formality of the political system, but in some ways that also gives protection to those actors in society to be able to access the political system. So power differences are real, and lastly also something to think about, specifically if we acknowledge that multi-level governance in its essence is much more about diffusing power and deconcentrating power than actually concentrating and centralizing power. And maybe in the discussion we have today, where we talk about the review of competences, we may be inclined to think about the concerns we have about the centralization of power at the EU level. But in some ways, yeah, I think it's worth it to think about what degree of centralization is then useful, because if we think about multi-level governance more in a way of decentralization and giving more power to the regions, there is nothing inherently good or bad about that. But one thing to keep in mind is that centralization is often necessary for identifying common goals. The main question, of course, is at what scale or what level do you want to have those common goals, and what are the maybe the identity-wise underpinning, or otherwise what kind of community do we foresee that gives the right scale, the right level for finding those common goals, and do our arrangements in terms of where decision-making takes place really facilitate that. I'm approaching the end of my talk now. The implications. So where does multi-level governance lead us? As you have noticed, I tried to be a little to give some controversial points here, because it will help for the discussion. One of the things, if we think about what multi-level governance may do, if it takes away decision-making power from the traditional parliamentary setting, from the traditional structures of representative bureaucracy, then the expectation would be that conflicts will move into other arenas, other venues. And I think there is reason to believe that this is actually the case. Now, what kind of other venues would we have in mind? I'm thinking about the media. I think with the rebate we really see that this is something that is being discussed much more in the media, and that the conflict is taking place there also with an audience of all of the Europeans. I'm thinking about the venue of bureaucracy and technocracy, and what kind of implications that might have. And also I'm thinking about the venue that is known to us all, the venue of the street, where citizens feel that their concerns and their interests are not so much served in the traditional parliamentary setting, and where they will have to resort to other kinds of ways to express their concerns. And then lastly, might multi-level governance also lead us to pseudo solutions that give everyone something but do not really address the essence of the original problem? And then to end with a last controversial point, can we think of multi-level governance in a way of a Faustian bargain? In other words, a pact with the devil where what is taking place is basically the selling or downgrading of the capacity to govern in an attempt to achieve more open and inclusive bargaining. What are the drawbacks of circumventing formal structures that are central to governing? And lastly, is multi-level governance really governance, or is it mainly a stage behind which strong actors can get their way, or behind which problems are left to linger? So this is something maybe to talk about. Now that I'm talking about it, maybe a little bit negative. It's not really what I mean to say, but it's something that I think may contribute to the debate, because normally an uncritical approach to multi-level governance will lead us into some implicit normative ideas that are good to make explicit. So thank you for this, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Casper. You've given us enough to debate about. When you concluded your speech, I was just thinking, is multi-level governance giving us more headaches than solutions? But it's just to provoke us for the debate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I think an answer to that question would be a great outcome of today.
Okay. Well, I give the floor the opportunity to react.
My name is Jan-Karel Jonker. I'm member of a committee of the VVD who advises on European issues. First, I want to thank you for this very good conceptual framework. And as I understand it, multi-level government is not in itself bad or good. I think it is a reality in Europe as well. I think the vices and the virtues are not specifically liberal. There is nothing new about it. But what is new, that we deal in Europe with the concept of an ever-closing union. That is has not been the case in the Middle Ages, I think. And that concept is now clashing with new political views, especially in Britain, that there should be a reshifting, a rebalancing of powers. And what is at stake is not, I think, the concept of multi-level government in itself, but what should be the direction into which the whole project will evolve. And I would like to have some comment of you or of others. How should we value, as liberals, that balancing problem?
Okay, thank you. You want to answer? Then you in the corner?
Yeah, of course, that's the having an answer to that would be sort of finding the holy grail in this discussion. But I would be very happy to have a go at that. One of the things that I thought was important when preparing for this was the idea of how important really is the place where a specific competency is where it's allocated compared to how actually regulation will take place, right? So I do think that it's very important from a democratic point of view and from an accountability point of view that the right arrangements are in place. But I also think that maybe so that's the legitimacy side basically, but then there's also the efficiency side, and I do think that multi-level governance offers more opportunities than the traditional, very much state-centered approach to think of ways where what is the best level and what is the best skill. So that's basically the whole idea of subsidiarity here, you could say. And the question, of course, is how do we look at that from a liberal point of view? I think our point of departure should definitely be freedom and democracy, of course, but also some sense of legitimacy in the sense that every citizen should accept the authority of the state and can actually reason why it is legitimate and logical that one particular level of government is responsible for a particular to address a particular policy problem. So I think the clarity and the transparency and sort of the reasoning behind the allocation of competencies to particular levels is something that we as liberals should be very keen on. So that would be I think a very rough guideline if you ask me how that balance should be found. What is the room there is to maneuver without running the risk of overstretch, where individuals and communities, if you will, do not recognize themselves in policies and arenas where important decisions are being taken.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for your excellent and thought-provoking presentation, Casper. In fact, it is very thought-provoking, and you raise many questions, for example, about how to deal with power in the concept of multi-level governance. One comment on this is that if it raises so much questions, and if we don't know how to deal with power, where does the practical relevance of multi-level governments lead us at some point, or are we just repeating a sort of dream on and it doesn't lead to any leads? That's more of a comment. I think at this stage people want more clarity as regards where we're going in the EU. But my question really concerns a delineation of where does multi-level governance apply and where doesn't it apply. It's generally used as a across-the-board concept. But if I look at central banks, for example, should we have 28 central banks in the EU? In the United States, I think they have 7. So that leads to a different perspective on multi-level government, that it's not an across-the-board concept, but that we really have to say, in this area it applies, and in this area it doesn't apply, maybe. That has to do with efficiency, for example, but also about being able to work together, because with 20 member states, multi-level government seems to become a rather inefficient concept to start off from. Aviation safety. We have planes, we have enormous big hubs in the EU. Does that mean we actually have to have a strong European component instead of building on across-the-board concept of multi-level government? So isn't it time that we move beyond the general discussions and really address sectors and say, okay, here it applies, here it doesn't apply, or here it... That's the sort of point where I think we have to start moving on towards, because otherwise we're stuck. And the problem here is that we're dealing now not with internal market problems. The multi-level concept was developed in the time of the internal market legislation. There was becoming more and more internal market legislation. We had more and more member states. Multi-level concept governance seemed to be sort of the 2000s debate, just ahead of the in the slipstream of Jacques Delors, but ahead of enlargement. But now we're dealing with the economic and monetary union, and I think that's a completely different context where we may have to reconsider multi-level governments more strongly. So about the sectors, basically, this is.
Thanks, Adriaan. Yes, I completely agree with you that the real significance of multi-level governance can only be visible at the sector level and at the actual policy level, and that there will be a huge degree of variation across policy sectors, given not only what kind of legal instruments can be used, what kind of the level of technicality, or the level of salience of each sector would all be variables that would co-determine what kind of multi-level governance you would see. But I also want to stress that it's not really the case that if there would be no more national central banks, that would be because of that there would be a higher degree of multi-level governance. It's not so much that because basically centralizing everything at the EU level would lower the degree of multi-level governance, rather than having some competencies at the European level, others remain at the national level, and what we need is to have a good sort of coordinating structure there. So it's not so much that reallocating competencies from one level to the other would necessarily make the system as a whole more, would increase the level of multi-level governance in the system as a whole. Multi-level governance only speaks to the idea that there is a sort of interdependency across the different levels, and that based on arguments coming from either the efficiency side or the legitimacy side, or maybe the distribution side, can determine what kind of powers should be where, and how those arrangements should work in practice. I also am, of course, triggered by your comment about how multi-level governance is that it's not a coincidence that the concept of multi-level governance became popular in the era in which most of the new European legislation was centered on the creation of the internal market, basically, and that maybe the problems that the EU is facing now, where new regulations and new legislation is coming out, is quite different, and maybe their multi-level governance may be not so applicable. At the same time, all that legislation that was created in the 1990s and early 2000s has now found its way into the national legal orders. And for me, the story doesn't really end there, because many of the questions that are central to multi-level governance actually become more prominent in the transposition, implementation, but also the application and enforcement side of European of EU law, basically. And here I think we see specifically, yes, in the newer member states, but we shouldn't ignore what's happening in the older member states when it comes to the actual application and enforcement of EU law, where again this problematic of how the different levels work together, what is harmonization, what is accountability in that multi-level structure, come to the fore. So I think I completely agree with you on the point of where new legislation is now being created, what sectors are being regulated at the moment or have been for the past 4 or 5 years. But at the same time, the internal market still keeps presenting us with important challenges that we can analyze and maybe address with the help of the concept of multi-level governance.
Okay, René Capiris. René is from the think tank of our present coalition friends in the Netherlands.
The Social Democrats. Oh. But I'm not talking about the social democratic perspective on multi-level governance here. Now, I like your presentation, very clear. Two comments or two questions for my understanding. To my astonishment, you did not refer to federal systems in Europe. Germany, hey, you mentioned some historical examples, but you did not refer to federal systems in Germany or in Belgium or Switzerland. To what extent can you describe them as multi-level governance, and are they very relevant for the European experience? Because the Germans are transforming the EU into a greater Germany, probably. So the lessons to be learned from multi-level governance in Germany are very relevant for this discussion, I think. So I was a bit surprised that you did not mention them. And I want to know more about how you perceive them. Another question is derived from the great liberal intellectual Jacques van Doorn. He always said politics should be or is about reduction of complexity. And this multi-level governance and this whole European developments, they are about completely an orgasm of complexity. And maybe there's a trade-off between democracy and complexity, especially for the non-internationally linked electorates. So by defending multi-level governance, and which is only there for the international elites, you are leaving behind democracy, I would say. So this reduction of complexity issue, I think, is very important for democracy.
Yes, I think two highly relevant points. I'll address them in the order you posed them. The idea of federalism is, of course, central to European integration for two reasons, or two main aspects are important here. First of all, of course, the EU is created by the member states and no one else. So the systems in place and the experiences of the different member states, of course, are the main source of input for the EU structure as a whole. And I think that specifically the German federal system since the Second World War is one that has had, from an ideational point of view, an extremely has played an important role. And secondly, the examples that I gave of member states that have actually reformed their own state structure, coinciding with the intensification of European integration, that cannot be seen as those things cannot be seen as two unrelated developments, of course. So on the one hand, the existence of the European Union to some extent gives the protection and the leeway for regions such as Catalonia to have their aspirations of independence, because on the monetary side, on the foreign policy side, the EU, as it were, gives a framework or an umbrella within which the exclusive powers of the member state, Madrid in this case, are not as conditional anymore. And lastly, the idea of federalism is, of course, very important in the debate that we normally refer to as Europeanization. So the idea of domestic change and domestic adaptation pressure towards what is coming out of the Brussels legislative machinery, basically. And here you basically see that both from a political and administrative side, but also from the side of public support for people who have been socialized in the federal system, it's of course much easier to accept the fact that they are part of a multi-level governance system. And whether it's a state system and above that the federal state system and it ends there, or whether there is another level in the form of the European Union, a basic logic of decision making and a logic of comparison between different levels of government is sort of inherent in their idea of what politics and governance is about anyway. So I think in that sense we do see a smaller, what used to be called a misfit between thinking about the member states arrangements and the EU arrangement. And at the same time we see that if we look at those reforms in state structures in all the EU member states and we analyze them systematically, the thing that we see is that basically in all of these member states where significant reforms have taken place, it has taken place in the direction of some sort of regionalization and federalization, not so much internal centralization, so to say. So in that sense, the domestic structures have become more multi-level in themselves as well. And then the second point, which is of course really interesting, if you say that politics is about decreasing the complexity in the society, I think here the idea of the normative elements in our way of talking about this are very important, because to me there is a very strong framing element here. Somebody who is a strong proponent of multi-level governance would not say that that a more centralized or more traditional way of governing is more simple, but that it's more rigid, and it doesn't take into account the conditions or the necessities particular policy problems may pose, or the differentiation in how communities within member states or within the European Union should be served, basically. So on the one hand, yes, of course, our traditional idea of representative democracy and deliberation within a parliamentary setting may lead to simplicity and transparency in some way. Of course, it has its drawbacks, and we shouldn't idealize that either. But from a multi-level governance point of view, actually the possibility to come with a more tailored arrangement depending on what the policy problem may demand or what the communities may demand is its basic advantage. So I think simplicity for one is rigidity for the other, and inclusiveness for the one is what you refer to as an orgasm of complexity for the other. So so that is, well, those are my thoughts on that. I forget what your real question about that would be, but
it was about Jacques van Doorn. It's
Yeah.
about the definition of politics,
Yes.
and also to what extent you can upscale politics and political problems and differentiate them so much that the whole polity, the whole arena of politics is completely eroding, which is problematic for democracy. So there may be a big tension between multi-level governance and democracy, especially on a scale of 500 million inhabitants of Europe. So that.
Yeah, and that is why I think if I referred again to the multi-level governance literature, that what scholars who are writing about this, who acknowledge that the power of representative democracy has eroded, what they do is they try to reconceptualize the idea of legitimacy in other terms. So yes, the traditional way of conceptualizing legitimacy would be, on the one hand, how democratic is it? What kind of democratic input can be given to the policy-making process, for instance? But a conceptualization of legitimacy in that multi-level governance tradition would be much more about throughput and output legitimacy. So what kind of results, what is the actual problem-solving capacity, can that, for instance, compensate for a decrease in the input legitimacy? But here it's also important to be aware of the fact that that increased problem-solving capacity may be a very convincing argument may have been a very convincing argument in the 1990s, in the time of economic growth, etc., and where things were looking up, basically. But in a way, it's more of a promise than an empirical assessment, that problem-solving capacity. And I think over the past 5 years, we have seen many examples also where multi-level governance we can say it has increased complexity, but has it also increased problem-solving capacity? That may be an open question.
Wouter Holstein.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation and the contribution in the discussion by the others already. I was wondering, I think perhaps the unease in or actually with the European Union is not about multi-level governance. I mean, everybody who's living together with a partner and or children has multi-level governance at home, so we all know about that. But I think the unease is that governance is taking over or gaining so much in weight to the loss of law and politics, or actually that politics is the loser of the three. Mm-hmm. And that is actually, that might be more a problem than multi-level governance. And if then also the law and the governance are from abroad, then the tension doubles or even more. Okay, that's so that the decisions are increasingly taken by the courts and by lawyers who are in their own, not to say bubble, but have their own discussion and their own way internationally. I mean, not only in Europe.
What we see a mirror image of that at the national level, where we have a lot of politics, where the media informs us on a very intense way about parliamentary debates or any type of political issue. But the idea then at the national level is that it's basically politics without policy, because the really framework policy and the main decisions would have been taken somewhere else already. So I completely agree in the sense that at the European level, the political side, in the terms of a transparent, democratically legitimated debate on worldviews and values, is missing. But and I think that what I tried to refer to in the presentation also is that the idea that that if the political debate at the European level is not that the idea that the political debate at the European level can be replaced by a technocratic and bargaining and networked kind of decision making, and that basically resolves conflict in a way. My alternative view on that would be is that yes, conflict may not be addressed in the political arena, but then it'll have to find its way in other venues. And as you say, I think the legal or maybe even the judiciary venue would be one where conflict then needs to be resolved in a way. So that also means a lower importance for the actual political or legislative arena and a greater burden on the judiciary branch, for instance.
We have a bit more time this morning, as Charlotte also already said. I have noted down 5 people who wanted to intervene, and I saw Adrian nodding that he wanted to. Do you want to react directly on this?
Well, it's whether you want to debate or.
That's true, but I
fully
don't want to make all
of
those people who want to intervene nervous.
Sure, I don't want
they're
to.
Getting their chance.
But just to let you decide whether you want to pursue this or not. It's politics without policy, policies without politics. It almost. Yes, I understand what you mean. Decisions are taken, people feel alienated from what happens, and decisions are taken at other levels. And wow, it sounds really serious. As if democracy is all that legitimizes. Sorry, democratic legitimacy is all that matters, but that is not the case. So, who would care if there's only one central bank and there's no multi-level government? As long as the system works, it's fine. When we had food problems, mad cow disease, or
but whose system? Whose system?
Well,
the system of the president of the central bank. If just trying to discuss in the floor.
Yeah. No. Okay. Let me take the other example. Food safety. We could have, when it was BSE, we could have created a food safety union or whatever, make it more democratic. The problem is solved. Who now really talks about the politics of food safety? There's a lot of policy that is where there is no politics, as long as it is really solved. So I think there's this discussion about we have to look at politics everywhere. It's maybe not so important, and that we might want to accept that we need to have certain systems that move beyond endless complexities, but actually do the trick and make things work so that the public isn't annoyed and then it isn't a political problem. And food safety to me is one of those examples where you can really see the EU has made it to work. We don't have endless political debates about food standards. The system works. Let's be grateful for it.
No, but like
if you want to debate,
no, but modification of foodstuff. I mean, if you see in Austria, for one instance, perhaps even Germany, but also Austria, every food package has not ingredients. And perhaps from the US, perhaps the UK point of view, the Dutch point of view, that would not be an issue for food safety. but for the audience, it's very much such an issue. So could you like, say that in a governance way, like weighing out well, who is right? Do the audience are right, or do the? I mean, you cannot translate that into like just a. I mean, what is food safety? It's about what you think. What is your food? What should your food be?
Well,
How should it be like?
my
You should produce it. Should it be fresh or not? Or
Well, my answer would be that yes, there are political problems in a big sector, but part of those problems are actually solved at a European level, and not all needs to be solved in a sort of multi-complex, multi-level society. I think the intellectual challenge, that's what I'm after, is where does multi-level governance not apply? Because that is where we really have to focus our attention on, because we can't go on telling the public, yes, there will be multi-level governance, whatever. The question is, where do we really need EU, and where are policy choices taken at the European level that are legitimate, so that we move beyond the mantra of multi-level governance. That's where I'm trying to get at in the debate.
Okay, I would say as a liberal that the first question would be, a political question would be whether there should be a policy at all. But now I want to give Arnoud Meijs the chance.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your presentation. Maybe to add on this, and to bring it back to the issue, the theme of today, how would you bring your story back to the concept of the competences review? Arjen also already discussed about the MLG for certain sectors and maybe not for others. So could you maybe explain a bit about that? And I also had another question that is about, you were saying that centralization is necessary for identifying common goals. How would you look at this from a more networked governance perspective, that centralization is absolutely necessary, and what do you mean by centralization? Thanks.
Alan Campbell already, and then Casper. Yeah.
Sorry, if I can just interrupt very quickly, because it's slightly linked, because there's a bit of a balance of competence overlap. As people realise, I'm a Scottish, British, European, so I've got lots of personal interest in multi-level governance. My question sort of for Casper is, a lot of your focus was on kind of Europe. You had a map of Europe, and my question is, how much have you also considered the international rules-based system as well? Because that's another thing. I mean, we're going to be looking probably downward a lot today, but we should also make sure we can also look upwards, and that's because some of the input we got in the balance of competence reviews also made that point that let's not forget there's also the other wider international systems that are sometimes on top. Civil aviation, I think Adrian already sort of flagged, but there's things like that, maritime, etc. So if, you know, have you thought about it in your kind of general thesis, and will we think about it as a whole as we progress today? Thank you.
So to bring it back to the review of competences debate, I think that ties in most directly with the idea of course, how are power and competencies divided across different layers of government, but also what kind of actual criteria would you use to decide at what level a specific competency should resort, basically, and I think that would be a topic for today. Of course, efficiency would be a great one, because nobody doesn't like efficiency, and everybody likes policy problems to be dealt with adequately. But the question, of course, is what is then adequate, and what kind of input is necessary to come to those adequate solutions. Even and that is even separate from your whole idea of what kind of structures you will have for the implementation and application of those rules, because I think multi-level governance is not just And now I find myself first criticizing multi-level governance and now defending it the whole time. But I think multi-level governance, I'm not a big fan of multi-level governance in its empirical manifestation, but I do think that the concept is helpful in thinking of how we organize accountability and how we organize sort of the chain of the chain from the first steps of a legislative process to the final stages of implementation of enforcement. And I think there it has value, and I think also that in the discussion of the review of competences, this should be something that should be taken into account. What happens after just the legislative process? And then you posed a question of centralization and how centralization is necessary for the identification of common goals. Maybe centralization is not the right term here, but at least what you need in politics is something, one way to aggregate visions and to aggregate interest up to a specific level where it is legitimate to make binding decisions that apply to everyone. So that's basically what the point I wanted to make, that you need some sort of centralization in politics to get to any type of decision, and centralization at what level is then the next question, and I think that question should be answered based on what is the what are the boundaries of the community? What do we see as a political community that that legitimizes the centralization at that level in order to come to conclusions that are binding for all members of that community? Yes, Alan, your question about the international rule system, I think, is a very important one. The easy answer is, of course, multi-level governance. If we agree that governance doesn't stop at the national level, why would it stop at the European level? There is something beyond that as well. But I think that one of the defining differences between what happens within the EU and in other international organizations is, of course, the level of development and the transfer of sovereignty that has happened in the EU much more than in other international, more intergovernmental organizations. I haven't included it here because it's not my specialty, but I do agree that in many cases, for instance, well, you mentioned aviation already, but also things like the International Labour Organization poses the frameworks of many, already sets the boundaries of even the leeway of where Europe can move. So in a way, it sort of it fits within the same logic.
I actually would like to add up to what Arnoud said to get it back to the link to the competences discussion, and I think what you illustrated quite well is that we have to move beyond the multi-level governance, but indeed multi-level governance. And it's not talking but just about one home with different layers, which Europe sometimes is called, and even different pillars, but also the other buildings, the banks, the airplanes, the cars, the people. Also, when we talk about democracy, people voting themselves. Isha, you made the PhD, the big research on that. I think that's also a point for discussion later today. So the question now is, if we can link it to what will Dirk-Jan talk about, how can we manage that to link that to the competences in the treaties? Because now the competence catalog is just linked to levels of national and European lawmaking or shared competence. And the question is, should we assign also the competences to the institutions who are indeed responsible for making the policies, for example, European Central Bank, and then is how do we organize that? And probably also to the subnational levels, if we, for example, see that now since the Lisbon Treaty, also talking about federal levels, also the regional levels in Belgium are highly involved in subsidiarity issues on EU decision making. So I'm quite curious how you consider those issues.
Perhaps I could just add a minor remark to your question. That was discussed during the European Convention, whether or not there should be an explicit catalogue of competences addressed to the European Union or to the member states or perhaps also other institutions. I'm not sure about the last one. But it was rejected by the member states because they feared, rightly so I think, that if they would say what they could do, that would mean that everything else would be done by European Union. So they would like to leave it this way as now it's put in the Lisbon Treaty. Just as a remark.
Yeah, I think the debate, Joost, you just touched upon, even goes beyond the debate of multi-level governance, where we have that vertical and horizontal dimension, because it also touches on the question: what kind of policies do you actually want? Do you want more regulatory policies, or do you also feel that, well, the EU, of course, is also heavily involved in redistributive policies, and what kind of methods do you think would help to address particular problems? So I think that would be something we can try to clarify here as well. And I also, your second point was about the role of subnational political entities. Basically, I do think that that their role will increase in the future, not just in Belgium, but the debate is actually, it's actually interesting from a Dutch point of view how little debate we've had on this compared to any other EU member state. So I think that will just gain in importance.
Okay. I would say as a liberal that redistribution is not something that liberals get quite warm about, Casper. Would you agree?
I don't think I said that it gave me any warm feelings. But,
okay.
I think often the EU is seen as a predominantly framework for regulation, but of course there are so many instances of the EU really being a major machine for redistribution, which is sometimes left out of the equation.
Okay, Pieter Kleppe.
Hello, I'm with Open Europe. It's a think tank, British think tank, and I represent it in Brussels. Just a small point regarding sort of the assumption that you have the EU level and then the national level and the regional levels. That's of course most of the time accurate, but in many cases what you see is not what you get, because what you see is an EU directive, but what's happening in reality is that national elites prefer to make the rules in Brussels as opposed to in The Hague, because it's so much more convenient. I give an example, the ban on classical light bulbs. If you would try to do that back in the capitals, in Berlin or London, you would have the tabloids on your back as a politician. So when you do it in Brussels, you have the environment ministers of the member states coming together, proposing this. It goes through the whole machinery. Then it's decided, and then suddenly everyone discovers that that there is a ban on classical light bulbs, and then we've actually witnessed in that case a lot of protest, a lot of hoarding in Germany, people maniacally trying to have as many light bulbs as possible for the future. So I would say that many people wonder, why is it that when politicians rise to power, that especially in the British debate, in the British context, that when they were previously quite Eurosceptic, so to speak, they become a lot more EU friendly. And I would say there's like a great incentive, if you're a policymaker, to do business at the Brussels level, away from national parliaments, away from the hard scrutiny of the media. And in that sense you can say that the EU, which is fundamentally of course a trade bloc, a free trade bloc, has been sort of abused as to serve as a policy level where national politicians can sort of more easily do what they want.
No, I would completely agree with that in some way it is completely legitimate to see the EU as a clever construction by member states governments in order to create a venue where they can also shop in cases where they feel it's easier to get specific policies through. Of course, it's that can happen in a large variety of ways. Either when there is no domestic political support for a specific legal instrument, you can try it in the Brussels arena. Or if you feel that you want some regulations that will help your country, but actually needs more policy change in another country. So both the effect within their own member state and in other member states, but their own member state can be at stake there. Yeah.
Raymond Kubbe.
Yep. Thank you. I'm a member of a different party committee of on the interior and on kingdom relations. So let's not forget that the Kingdom of the Netherlands is also a federal state. Yeah, it is. Absolutely. And the constitutional law is it has no federal government, but it is a federal state. Very peculiar one. But besides that, so thank you for your presentation, which is very, I think, well thought and well balanced. And I have two questions on that. And the first one comes from, let's say, what I always like to take as the, let's say, the basic, to me is the basic liberal point of departure for discussions like this, and that is that no political system has any inherent value, but is to be judged on whether it contributes to individual liberty or not. And then we have in liberal theory several standards, and there's two ways to go with to judge system or whatever, and then there's two ways to go: stick to the old standards that were defined within the state-centric paradigm, or redefine them to be useful in new realities. And in so the first question would be in that respect, could the redefining of liberal standards to judge political systems and government and governance, redefining that, does that need to be integrated, and can it be integrated in theorizing on multi-level governance, for instance, as a way to redefine or re-operationalize the ratio behind the separation of powers as a, let's say, a standard of deconcentrating power, preventing arbitrariness, checks and balances, that kind of stuff. Can you redefine that from the, let's say, the traditional trias that is state-centric to this kind of ideas? And the same with the old idea, very basic idea of value of decentralization, which is part of liberal political ideas, in my view. Also as a way of vertical separation. Can you use that and redefine that to, let's say, to take the liberal standards on board of this kind of theorizing? And the second question has to do with that the Delta Stichting is preparing a report on sovereignty. And I'm on a small group that does that. So that would be a big, and that's of course a big question there as well. And that's on the locus of sovereignty. If this is the reality of this deconcentration of multi-levels and all kinds of places and levels where decisions are taken, is there still a role for sovereignty? Or you can take that to the meta level, of course, when sovereignty is, then it's not on who takes the decisions, but on who decides on who can make decisions on what. But the question to you would then be, is that still part of that? So is there still a role of sovereignty in that sense, or is it just a concept that doesn't make sense anymore?
Thank you. Yeah, the first question is one that is difficult for me, because I haven't really I don't normally put much thought in that, in the sense that from an academic point of view, I don't really look at these matters from one or the other ideological point of view. But I do think, now that you ask it, because it's relevant for the discussion, I think in this company here, what exactly are our liberal points of departure? I mean, you mentioned the maximization of liberty, basically, as one point. But if we look at how, if we look at the European Union, or even beyond that in the international sphere, we can also think of liberal thought in the sense that how liberalism in international relations is conceived of, for instance, national sovereignty, for instance, and that would be a very different lens to look at that. So I think it would be an interesting discussion, but I don't have the answers to that right now. And your second point, can you restate that?
Is there still a role for the concept of sovereignty
Oh, yes.
in this kind of, or not? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that is of course very much related. I think in sovereignty as it was developed and as we know it in the sort of Westphalian state is something that has always been much more of a theoretical construct than an empirical reality. So the myth around that can also be traced back to much earlier times. But I think the developments, as we're discussing today, the formation of the European Union as we know it now, in that discussion, the classical theoretical construct of sovereignty, to my mind, has not much value, or maybe in a different way. But the classical conception, as we know it from 1648 and after, what we see in the textbooks on international relations, or maybe on legal thought, is something that I think has lost much of its resonance.
About Hulsang?
Yes, just making a comment or adding to the contribution, just on the last topic, just very short. I think, to my belief, that sovereignty is as dead as the autonomy of the European Union is dead. I mean, autonomy of the European Union is sovereignty. It's the same claim. That is that the European Union has its own legal system, an own legal structure, which legitimizes itself and is based upon itself, and has no external source for whatever. That is what autonomy of European Union law is. There's no external source. That is sovereignty. I mean, sovereignty is not dead; it's just being replaced, moved from one way, from one spot to another spot. And it is the same kind of sovereignty as the Westphalian system sovereignty, that there is an apex, and at the apex it all starts, or there is a bottom where it all starts, depends on where you see it from a democratic point of view or not. And then secondly, about liberalism, because I think that an interesting question also in this venue here. I think liberalism is about this redistribution, but then of freedom. And what kind of freedom does then this multi-level business mean? Or the European Union, what kind of freedom does it bring to the citizens, to the individuals? Does it bring more liberty, less liberty? If more liberty, the same quality of liberty? I mean, the light bulbs issue is not only about ministers taking decisions away from the media spectre and the lights of the medium, but also about the businesses, Philips and Osram, wanting to do different business with the LED lamps, because the LED bulbs, they bring more money. And the Chinese were already taking over the light bulbs issue, the light bulbs business. So they moved this way. This was their way of getting out competition, getting rid of competition. And they did it in a very, very, very efficient way. The decision was taken within, I don't know, you probably know better, but within months the decision was taken to
Excuse me, but is there any proof of that?
Yes, there is. There are many.
Because I buy my LED bulbs from China by IKEA.
There was an article in the Morgen. There was a Belgian investigative journalist, Douglas de Koning, and he wrote a whole article about how Philips and Osram has been.
Sorry, but that is not academic proof.
Well, okay,
I'll take it as an interesting point, but really we are making massive claims here on the basis of what?
I think every single piece of legislation is being heavily lobbied in Brussels. That's
of course, but that doesn't mean it's wrong.
But
this is not a way to talk about the policies of the EU. I mean, this is serious business. We cannot just offhand do away with the policies on light bulbs by saying this is done by lobbyists. I mean, that's far too cheap.
Well, I'm not an expert on academic proof, but just about liberty. What kind of liberty does the European Union bring us then? I mean, for some people it does bring less liberty, because, for instance, they perhaps less type of liberty, because now they have to compete with other people on the same labor market, so they feel less free to do with their spare time what they want, because now they have to work harder, for instance. But for other people who now can go to hospitals abroad for better treatment, which is now being paid by their own home country, they achieve more kind of liberty. So what kind of liberty would then bring us, the European Union, more or differently? Or
Maybe just one remark I wanted to make on the point of sovereignty that you raised, in the sense that nothing much has changed and that sovereignty has just moved to a different level from the state level to the EU level in that sense. Okay, maybe of course this supports the fact that we need to be very clear in our concept. I think that state sovereignty, in the sense that that it is treated, how it's treated in international relations, where you have a state who is not internally and not externally contested, you know. So both the territorial boundaries, it's acknowledged by by the other states, etc. In that sense, I don't think sovereignty at the EU level is just something that moved to a different level and is still the same concept. Because first of all, I think it would be hard to argue that the EU's autonomy and self-determination is not internally contested. And secondly, also from an external point of view, what are the peers of the EU that would sort of guarantee its right of existence? Because it is so, because it is a unique construction, I think the basic claims that we have normally, that we have traditionally made in international relations about what state sovereignty is, are very difficult to apply to the EU level.